Nice to see you again. You all heard from the prior panel that I'm an FCC telecom regulatory lawyer in DC, but my practice does involve international policy. So I'm delighted to be joined today, of course, by Dr. Pepper on stage, who's, as you heard, with Meta, working on infrastructure. And online, of course, we have Malcolm Johnson. You did introduce him, but we're delighted to have Malcolm here with us, the Deputy Secretary of the International Telecommunication Union. Gisa, nice to see you from Samoa, and Yamauchi-san, thank you for joining us from Tokyo. I know these hours are a little difficult for you guys online, so thank you for joining us despite perhaps what is your bedtime. So thank you. Well, I'll kick it off with Gisa and Yamauchi-san. Of course, COVID, as we know, just immediately put a huge stress on all our networks and a challenge to keep everybody's population connected so they could continue to work, to be educated, to consult health authorities. So how did your countries respond to that sudden shift to online existence? And we can start with Gisa.
Thank you very much. It's a pleasure to be here and to see my colleague Malcolm Johnson. As you may know, that I used to work for the ITU. But back to the program, yes, Samoa, like every other country, did experience a very high demand for the internet. And because the internet is playing a crucial role in keeping critical infrastructure and resources connected and available. And that means government services and private sector all require high-speed internet. In particular for COVID, medical institutions require access to to regional and global information networks and resources necessary to fight the virus. And this is very important. So therefore, broadband connectivity is now absolutely crucial for education also. Businesses could continue essential services. And most important for me is the communications between people here in Samoa and our people living in the four corners of the world. So I'll stop there for the next part.
Thank you, Gisa. And you make a good point, of course, that broadband was not only critical for our citizens, for all their connectivity needs, whether it be social or educational or work, but of course was critical for the government's response to COVID, for tracking testing and educating populations on what was available in terms of vaccines and policies. So yeah, of course, that connectivity was so crucial during the last 2 years. Yamauchi-san, how about in Japan? Did the ministry have to take special measures to respond to the COVID emergency?
Okay, thank you very much. Yes, before that, I would like to explain the situation in Japan. And, actually, the penetration rate of FTTH in Japan is more than 99%. So almost all people have a broadband access. But MIC has research of the influence of COVID-19 at the end of the year of 2020, so about 1 year ago. Based on the research, about 70% of the people were sufficient of the quality of the network. So it means majority feels good. But about 30% was insufficient of with the quality, and that was mainly because the big demand of telecommunication methods, including the telework and teleeducations, So almost of you know, we have to have the telework and tele-educations from the 2020. So many people want to have wider methods of communication, broadband communications. And I would like to explain why we want to the more method, the broader methods, or the background of the communications. That's my first comment.
Well, thank you, Yamauchi-san. Of course, Malcolm, the ITU had to quickly pivot too from an in-person, very populous gathering point to all virtual, and you weathered that fairly well, I would say. As a user of the ITU platforms for some of the radio sector meetings, I can say that you developed very intuitive and effective platforms. But of course, it's been going on for a while, and now you've got in 2022 a number of conferences you're having to deal with, and maybe in a virtual setting for at least another half year. But maybe you can walk us through the conferences that the ITU will be hosting this year and the purpose and mission of each of those conferences.
Well, thank you, Tricia, and thanks to PTC for inviting me. Aloha to everyone. Nice to see my good friends Bob, Gisa, and Tomoo-san. I've had the pleasure of attending 3 PTCs, so very sorry that I'm not with you in person this time. And well, normally ITU has a world conference every year over a 4-year cycle. So because of the pandemic, we've had 2 of these delayed. So we have the World Telecom Standards Assembly this year, followed by the World Telecom Development Conference, and then the Plenipotentiary Conference. So 3 world conferences all in 1 year. It's never happened before, quite unprecedented, as you say, and going to be quite a challenge, not only for our members, but for the Secretariat to support 3 world conferences all in 1 year with the COVID situation, of course. As you say, we worked very well virtually for nearly 2 years now. We had the World Telecom Policy Forum fully virtual, but the intention is that we will have the World Telecom Standards Assembly in March physical. So that'll be the first physical conference since the start of the pandemic, scheduled to be held in Geneva. It was originally going to be in India in 2020. It'll be on from the 1st to the 9th of March, and it'll be preceded by the Global Standards Symposium on the 28th of February. So it'll be a chance for the ITU's standards makers to look at the situation that's developed over the last few years, especially during the pandemic, with the increased demand, of course, placed on the networks. It's incredible how well they've stood up to this tremendous increase in demand. So a lot of congratulations to the network operators and platform providers and the regulators for being able to provide for this huge increase in demand. But the Assembly will be looking at how we can better work together to ensure that we do have the international standards necessary to ensure that we continue to provide this level of service. So collaboration with other standards bodies is very important, and that's what the Global Standards Symposium, the one day before the Assembly, will look at. It'll invite leaders from other standards bodies to come together to see how we can work together, avoid duplication of effort, and avoid any competition between us, work together. I mean, we in ITU focus on a few particular areas, especially on environmental issues, smart cities, increasingly working with the World Health Organization on health standards, and also, of course, digital financial inclusion. So I'm sure after such a long wait, 2 years waiting for that conference, it's going to be a very interesting conference. And of course, we may not get the usual participation level because of the situation, but at least we're hoping that it'll be a successful physical conference for the first time since the start of the pandemic. And then in June, we have the World Telecom Development Conference, which was postponed from last year. It's Ethiopia is offering to host it in Addis Ababa. And this is the World Conference for the Development Sector of the ITU, whose prime focus, of course, is to bring affordable connectivity to people around the world. And that remains quite a challenge. 2.9 billion people still offline, and 96% of those are living in the developing countries. And also, people in urban areas are twice as likely to be able to use the internet as those in the rural areas. So that's another big divide that needs to be addressed. So the Development Conference will be looking at this. We've got the advantage that this pandemic has raised the awareness of the importance of the technology. So we have a lot of political will now to bring access to people around the world. Otherwise, there's no way that the UN Sustainable Development Goals will be met. And we've got a couple of new innovations. We've got the Global Youth Summit prior to the conference to get the very vital input from youth, and also a new partnership initiative to bring in more active participation from the private sector, from academia, and civil society. And then finally, we have the scheduled Plenipotentiary Conference, which will be hosted by Romania in Bucharest. That's from the 26th of September to the 14th of October. So that's the conference that elects ITU's 5 elected officials, the Secretary General, Deputy Secretary General, and the 3 directors, as well as the 48 members of the ITU Council and the 12 members of the part-time Radio Regulations Board. Its main purpose is to adopt the strategic and financial plans, which will set out the priorities for ITU over the next 4 years and the financial resources to accomplish them. And this is going to be a very particularly challenging 4-year period for the ITU, because we have the new building project, $173 million project, to construct a new headquarters building on the ITU premises site. So it's basically going to be a building site for 4 years. That's going to be quite a challenge for the staff. And of course, for delegates, we have to find other places to host our meetings. It'd be nice to have a few in Honolulu. And so that, plus the fact that this pandemic has meant that so many other organizations are making use of the technology, that there's a great risk of duplication of effort and a threat to ITU's core remit. So that's going to be a topic for consideration, and how we can have better public-private sector collaboration at the regional, national, and international level. So those are the main points for that conference. I should say that there's one conference missing, thankfully, for this year, but it'll be on next year. The World Radio Conference, probably the most significant conference in ITU, which amends the international treaty on the use of the radio spectrum and satellite orbits, and that will take place next year in the UAE from the 20th of November to the 15th of December. So yes, as you say, a truly key year for ITU.
Well, thank you, Malcolm. And I would be remiss if I didn't mention that the United States has a candidate for the Secretary General position of the ITU, and that vote will be at the Plenipotentiary. We are running Doreen Bogdan-Martin, so of course we wish her luck in that endeavor. And here in Honolulu, we're having our first PTC that is hybrid, both in person, like Pepper and me, and you guys. So good luck, and hopefully these conferences of yours will be hybrid as well, both in person and have a digital online component as well, because yes, you have gotten that component down, I have to say. Now, Pepper, of course, Meta is all about digital inclusion and affordable connectivity through infrastructure. You're deploying infrastructure around the world, increasingly in the subsea space. But what are you telling regulators about how to make sure their networks are future-proof for all the capacity growth we've seen over COVID?
Yeah, thanks, Tricia. And it's great to see our colleagues online. We can do a hybrid. I'm going to focus on subsea because with PTC here, with the people, the sessions we've had, the all-day workshop on submarine cable systems, in addition to the other infrastructure investments that we're doing. We're always partnering. We're building out subsea systems to help increase capacity, connect the world. Within the last 6 months, we've announced, for example, the first cables, or within the last year, we announced the first direct U.S. to Indonesia cables by Frost and Echo. We're building cables across to the Philippines, for example, and that one's moving forward. And it's not just us. We do this, as I mentioned, in partnership. And when we look at this in aggregate, the investments over the next just 5 years in subsea systems across this region, right, the APAC region, is going to add literally hundreds of billions of dollars of GDP and millions of jobs. This is really important. And it's the knock-on effect. It's not just the subsea systems, but the bandwidth and the international connectivity in each of the countries. And it begins to address some of the issues that, for example, Malcolm raised, the 2.9 billion people not yet connected to the internet. And in working with countries globally, there's some countries that make it easy to do those deployments, and that's great. And there are other countries where it becomes more difficult. And that becomes barriers. Every country and every policymaker I talk to wants these cables. They want the new capacity. They see this as really important for their economy, for their society, and yet some of them haven't quite figured out how to make it easy to do that. So, for example, there are really the recommendations, the issues come into 4 baskets. Licensing and foreign ownership. If you want foreign investment, you have to permit foreign ownership. And that's not always been the case. There's good news. Last week, Bangladesh, the regulator in Bangladesh announced that it was really dramatically reforming its foreign ownership restrictions and opening it up for all kinds of investment from foreign operators and ownership. That's a big deal. That will unleash investment, to build systems to Bangladesh. In terms of the licensing, the procedures for licensing have to be clear, streamlined, and transparent, and available to anybody. That's the licensing and the permits. That's not always the case. And then on the deployment and landings, there needs to be flexibility. One of the reasons, when we look, we always want diversity of landings for, the integrity and the safety of the cables. You have, it can be an undersea volcano,
Right.
or it can be a fishing vessel or a ship with an anchor. I mean, you want diversity of routing. So, and you also want diversity of landings, and not every country allows that, and they have very narrow corridors of where you're permitted to put the cables. So we try to explain, you want cables and you want them You want the system to operate. You have to give us the flexibility to have, multiple or different landing options. And if you have a corridor, that's fine, but make it wide so that you know where it goes. Once you land the cable, you have to open up the cable landing stations. It doesn't do any good if you have competition and a lot of bandwidth coming into your country. If all of the operators, the various ISPs, everybody can connect and take advantage of those new cable systems. So you need to open up landings, liberalize the connections, and then finally you need to protect, you need the protection for the cables and the ability to repair. So, you want cable protection zones. Not every country has them, or if they have them, they don't necessarily enforce it. And then finally, for repair, some countries have very, very stringent and restrictive procedures for this very specialized repair ships. It's called cabotage, right? And limiting, these repair ships, if they're not locally owned, to be able to come in and repair the cables. So these are the 4 baskets of really basic best regulatory practices that we see are necessary to attract the investment that every country wants. And this is really important. And we're making huge investments globally, but especially in this region.
Very interesting. And Yamauchi, are you seeing a lot of investment from Japanese providers in the subsea space? From perhaps Docomo or KDD?
Yes, that's right. However, in Japan, the network facilities such as data centers and IXs are centralized around Tokyo. And we may have the massive disasters such as earthquake or the eruption of the volcano. So all of you know the volcano eruption in Tonga, and now they suffered severe influence from these volcanoes. So now we can't communicate with Tonga. So that's why we promote decentralization of the traffic aggregation centers and the collaboration among ISPs. So it means both operational and facilities. And now we have some budget for supporting operators to fund the network facilities, including cables and IXCs and data centers. That's our activities. That's my comment.
Thank you. And I don't know if we have Gisa with us. I was going to ask her if she is seeing interest by operators for greater connectivity in Samoa, or if there's pressure to perhaps change some of their policies to encourage some of that investment you were talking about, Pepper. Is Gisa still with us? Well, connectivity is an issue, right? So that's always a concern. Well, Malcolm, turning back to you, then the ITU has traditionally been a leader in helping developing countries right on some of the policies. Do you expect some discussion at the policy forum or the development conference on regulatory policies that attract investment, as Yamauchi and Pepper were talking about?
Yes, that's right. I mean, it's very important that we have the enabling environment to attract investment from the private sector, especially, as I mentioned earlier, it's the rural areas that are really lacking in connectivity, because obviously there's not the same return on investment for industry in those areas as there is in the urban areas. So we have to incentivize industry to invest in the rural areas and ensure that we have the policy in place that does provide for that investment and encouragement for that investment. And also, of course, it's important that we have these regulatory policies harmonized across the world, because companies don't want to go to different countries and try and figure out, their own specific regulatory policies. It's much easier if most countries are all in line. So that's another important aspect of the discussion that we will be having in the development conference, and it builds on what was discussed at the World Telecom Policy Forum at the end of last year.
I'm afraid we've run out of time, so I wish you luck at those conferences and luck with your goals. And thank you, panel, for joining us. Thank you for being here today.